Alban wasn't born into faith. His story began with a single risky choice: sheltering a stranger in danger. That decision changed his life and the lives of countless others for centuries. But here's the question: would you have had the courage to do the same? When faced with death, Alban didn't waver. He stood firm, knowing his story wasn't really about him. It was about something far greater. And that's why his faith still speaks louder than fear, even now. What could your story look like if you lived with that kind of boldness? Before we dive into Alban's powerful story, take a moment to think. What would you stand for, even if it cost you everything? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll see why Alban's courage and faith still inspire us today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss a story that reminds us what faith truly looks like. Have you ever thought about what it would really cost to stand up for what you believe in? I'm not talking about a moment of bravery in an argument or a small sacrifice here and there. I mean everything. What would you do if your faith or your values were challenged in a way that put your life on the line? Centuries ago, in a world far different from ours, but in many ways, strangely similar, a man named Alban faced that exact choice. At first, he was just like many of us, going about his life, unaware of the extraordinary courage buried within him. He wasn't born a hero. He wasn't born a saint. He was just Alban. But then, a knock on his door changed everything. This was a time when being a Christian wasn't just unpopular. It was a death sentence. People were hunted, tortured, and executed, all for refusing to deny their faith. And yet, in the middle of all that fear, Alban made a choice that would ripple through history. What he didn't know, as he opened his home to a fleeing priest, was that this act of kindness would set him on a path to becoming something much more than a bystander. He would become a martyr. Believers, this is not just a story about suffering. It's about courage. It's about how the smallest acts of compassion can lead to something far greater than we can imagine. Alban's choice reminds us of the power of faith to light up the darkest of times. But to truly understand the weight of Alban's decision, we need to look at the world he lived in, a world gripped by fear, where faith came at a terrible price. What was it like to be a Christian when every choice could mean life or death? Let's step back into that time where persecution was the air they breathed. Believers, have you ever stopped to think about what it means to live in constant fear? Not for something you've done, but for who you are? That was a reality for Christians during Alban's time. This was a world where rulers demanded absolute loyalty, not just to their laws, but to their gods. Statues of stone and metal weren't just decorations in Roman cities. They were symbols of power, control, and fear. Refusing to bow before them wasn't seen as a harmless act of personal belief. It was treason, and the punishment? Death. Picture this. You're living in a bustling town. You see soldiers patrolling the streets, always watching, always listening. Neighbors whisper, afraid to speak too loudly in case someone might report them. And somewhere nearby, in the shadows, a small group of Christians gathers in secret, praying, sharing bread, and encouraging one another to stay strong. Why would they risk so much? Why not just stay silent, go along with the rules, and keep their faith hidden? Because to them, faith wasn't something they could bury or ignore. It wasn't a hobby or a habit. It was life itself. They believed in a God who was greater than emperors, stronger than fear, and more eternal than death. But this faith came with a cost. When a Christian was caught, there were no second chances. They were beaten, dragged through the streets, and often executed publicly, used as an example to warn others. Families were torn apart. Friends betrayed friends to save themselves. And yet, the faith didn't crumble. If anything, it grew. Even in the darkest corners of this world, light refused to go out. And it's in this darkness that we find Alban. A man who didn't yet know Christ but would soon face the same choice as those persecuted believers: safety or sacrifice, silence or courage. But how does a man who begins as a stranger to the faith become one of its greatest witnesses? How does someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose step forward and say, "I will stand"? To answer that, we need to look at a single moment, one that changed Alban's life forever. The conversion of Alban, a light in the darkness. Believers, have you ever had a moment that turned your entire world upside down? A moment when everything you thought you knew didn't matter anymore, and a new truth suddenly became impossible to ignore? For Alban, that moment came when a man, a Christian priest, knocked on his door. This man wasn't a family member or an old friend. He was a stranger running for his life. He needed a place to hide, and Alban had a choice to make. He could have turned him away. No one would have blamed him. After all, sheltering a Christian back then wasn't just risky, it was deadly. But something stirred in Alban's heart, something he couldn't explain. And instead of sending the man away, Alban opened his home. At first, it probably felt like an act of pity or perhaps simple kindness. But the longer the priest stayed, the more Alban noticed something about him. This man, even in hiding, wasn't afraid. He prayed constantly, morning, noon, and night. His words weren't the desperate cries of someone who'd lost hope. No, they were filled with strength, trust, and something Alban couldn't quite name. What would you do if you saw that kind of faith up close? Would it inspire you? Confuse you? Maybe both? For Alban, it was both. He watched this priest and started to feel something shift inside himself. He began to question the gods he'd grown up with, the rituals he'd followed without much thought. And little by little, as the priest shared his faith, Alban began to believe. Can you picture it? A man who had never called himself a Christian, suddenly kneeling in prayer. A man who had once lived in darkness, now stepping into the light. Alban wasn't just hiding the priest anymore. He was learning from him, being transformed by the same faith that had given the priest so much courage. Believers, this is where the story takes a turn, because faith isn't just about personal change. It's about action. And Alban's newfound faith would soon be tested in a way he never could have expected. The authorities were closing in. Soldiers came searching for the priest, ready to drag him away to face the worst kind of punishment. And Alban, who could have handed the man over and saved himself, made another choice. A choice that would seal his fate and mark him forever as a witness to the power of God. But what does it take for someone to stand up to an entire system of fear and oppression? What gives someone the strength to risk it all, even when they know the cost? Let's find out as we follow Alban to the moment that would define his life forever. Alban's arrest, the courage to stand alone. Believers, have you ever wondered what you do when faced with an impossible choice? Not a small decision, but one that could cost everything. Your safety, your future, maybe even your life? That's where Alban found himself one fateful day. The soldiers came pounding on his door, demanding the Christian priest he was hiding. The priest, the man who had taught Alban about faith, who had opened his eyes to a truth he could no longer deny. He was the one they wanted. But Alban, now a believer himself, made a decision that startled even the soldiers. He stepped forward and declared, "Take me instead." Can you imagine the courage it took to do that? To look danger square in the face and willingly step into its path? Alban didn't flinch. He put on the priest's cloak and let the soldiers take him, knowing full well what awaited him. As they led him away, the city was buzzing with whispers. People stared. Some pitied him. Others mocked him. But Alban walked with his head high, not because he didn't feel fear. He was human after all, but because his faith was stronger than his fear. Believers, have you ever stood alone for something you believed in? If you have, you know how heavy that moment feels. And if you haven't, imagine what it must have been like for Alban, a man with no army, no allies, just the quiet strength of his conviction. What happens next is nothing short of remarkable. Alban's courage would be tested even further, and his words, his testimony, would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Let's step into the next chapter, Trial in Faith. Trial in Faith, Alban's testimony. Believers, there comes a moment when every conviction is put to the test. For Alban, that moment arrived when he stood before the judge, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. The room was thick with tension. The judge, standing at the altar of his false gods, demanded Alban bow down and offer a sacrifice. It was a simple gesture, the judge argued, just a pinch of incense. But for Alban, it wasn't simple at all. It was a denial of everything he now stood for. The judge sneered. "Who are you?" he barked. "What makes you defy the gods of the empire?" Alban, calm but unshaken, answered, "My name is Alban. I serve the living God, the creator of all things. These idols you worship, they are powerless." The crowd gasped. People whispered, but Alban wasn't finished. He looked the judge in the eye and said, "I would rather lose my life than betray my faith." Can you feel the strength in that statement? Think about it. How easy it would have been for him to give in, to say the words they wanted to hear just to save himself. But Alban's heart was set on something far greater than his own comfort or survival. The judge, enraged by Alban's defiance, ordered him to be tortured. They whipped him, hoping the pain would break his resolve. But Alban didn't waver. His faith was unshakable, his spirit unbreakable. Believers, have you ever faced a moment where standing firm came at a cost? Alban's story reminds us that true faith doesn't crumble under pressure, it shines. And yet, Alban's trial wasn't the end of his story. What happened next defied logic and left even his enemies in awe. Let's walk with Alban now to the place of his execution, where miracles unfolded. Miracles on the way to execution. Believers, have you ever wondered if courage can stir the very forces of nature? Alban's final walk to his execution was no ordinary journey. It was a moment when heaven itself seemed to intervene, as if to remind the world that this man's sacrifice was seen and honored by God. Picture this. Alban, bruised but resolute, was led by soldiers through the streets. Crowds gathered to jeer and mock him, their words echoing against the stone walls. But Alban's eyes weren't on them. He walked with the calm of a man who knew where his path was leading and whom he served. Now, here's where things take an incredible turn. As the procession approached the bridge over the river, something unexplainable happened. The crowd swelled, pressing in on every side, and the bridge itself became impassable. But Alban didn't hesitate. He raised his eyes to heaven, whispered a prayer, and stepped forward. And then the river parted. Yes, it split, creating a dry path right through its middle. Witnesses stood frozen, their shouts replaced by gasps. Even the soldiers escorting him couldn't deny what they had seen. It was as though creation bowed in reverence to the faith of one man. Believers, think about this. How often do we feel like the obstacles in front of us are too great? Yet here was Alban, walking calmly across a river that made way for him. Not because of his power, but because of his unshaken trust in God. But the miracles didn't stop there. One of the soldiers, moved by Alban's faith in the undeniable presence of the divine, threw down his sword and declared himself a follower of Christ. Imagine the courage it took for that soldier to make such a choice, knowing the consequences. This wasn't just a walk to execution. It was a testament to the power of faith to transform hearts, even in the darkest of moments. And now, we come to the final act of Alban's story, the place of his ultimate sacrifice, where faith would meet its greatest test. Let's step forward together into the moment that sealed his legacy, the moment he received the martyr's crown. Believers, have you ever paused to consider what you would give for your faith? Alban's story takes us to that moment, his final moment, a moment where faith stood taller than fear. Led to the hill where he would face his death, Alban walked with a steady step. He had no armor, no weapon, no earthly shield. All he carried was his unshaken trust in the God he now served. The hill was quiet, except for the murmur of the crowd that had followed. Some came out of curiosity, others out of hatred, and a few, perhaps a few, came out of awe. Alban looked at them, not with anger, but with compassion, as though he could see beyond their jeers to the hearts that needed saving. As he reached the execution site, even his executioner hesitated. This wasn't a man filled with regret or fear. This was someone who radiated peace, someone who believed that death wasn't the end, but a doorway. That kind of certainty, it changes people. And then, in an act of extraordinary faith, Alban knelt. With his face turned upward, he prayed, not for himself, but for those around him, for the ones who hated him and the ones who would one day hear his story. The executioner, overcome by Alban's courage, laid down his sword, refusing to continue. Another soldier stepped forward, but even in that final act, Alban's light didn't dim. He met his death with a calmness that left everyone who witnessed it changed. Believers, think about this. Alban's story didn't end on that hill. His faith, his courage, it planted seeds in the hearts of those who watched. Seeds of hope, seeds of belief. What kind of impact could our own faith have if we were willing to stand as boldly as Alban did? But Alban's legacy didn't stop with his death. It rippled outward, inspiring others to stand firm, no matter the cost. Let's reflect on that legacy together. Let's see how one man's sacrifice changed countless lives. Legacy of Alban and his companions. Believers, stories like Alban's don't fade. They grow. His life and sacrifice lit a flame that couldn't be extinguished, no matter how hard the forces of the time tried to snuff it out. But what exactly did he leave behind? What did his courage spark? When Alban knelt on that hill, he wasn't just giving his life, he was creating a ripple. His bravery emboldened others to stand firm in their faith. Even when it seemed like the whole world was against him, his death wasn't just a loss, it was a beginning. Have you ever thought about what it means to leave a legacy? It's not about being remembered for something grand. It's about planting something in others that keeps growing. Alban's story became a beacon for Christians facing persecution, reminding them that faith can outlast any fear. And it wasn't just Alban. The companions who walked their paths alongside him, enduring trials of their own, added to that legacy. Together, they showed the world what it means to truly believe, what it means to sacrifice everything for something greater than yourself. Even the very place where Alban's life was taken, Verulamium, now St. Albans, became a center of faith, a reminder of his courage. People travel for miles to remember, to pray, and to draw strength from the story of a man who stood alone, yet never truly was. Believers, think about this. How far does your own faith reach? What seeds are you planting in the lives of those around you? Alban's legacy challenges us to live boldly, to stand for truth, and to trust that even small acts of courage can inspire generations. Let's take a moment to reflect on these lessons. What do we learn from Alban's story, and how can it shape the way we live today? Lessons from Alban's story. Believers, what do you think Alban would say if he could speak to us today? If he could look into your eyes, knowing the world we live in, what would he want you to take away from his story? Alban didn't set out to be remembered as a hero or a saint. He wasn't someone looking for recognition or praise. He was just a man who found himself standing in the gap for someone in need. When he made the choice to protect the priest, he wasn't thinking about history books or churches being named after him. He was thinking about doing what was right, no matter the cost. And isn't that what faith calls us to? To live with courage in the small moments, even when no one is watching. To stand firm when fear whispers that it's easier to stay silent. Think about this. What if Alban had stayed quiet, had decided the risk wasn't worth it? His life would have been simpler, safer. But would it have been full? Believers, sometimes the hardest decisions we face are the ones that shape not just our own lives, but the lives of others, too. Alban's story reminds us that we don't need to be extraordinary to do something extraordinary. Faith is often about simple choices, choosing love over hate, truth over lies, and hope over fear. And those choices, no matter how small they seem, can echo far beyond what we'll ever know. So, let me ask you, how will you stand? What will your faith look like when the stakes are high? Will you trust that God can use even your smallest acts of courage for something far greater? Let's take a deeper look at what Alban's final witness means for us today. His story isn't over, believers. In fact, it's still speaking. Alban's eternal witness. Believers, as we reach the end of Alban's story, let's pause for a moment. What does it mean for someone to leave a mark on this world? Not through power or wealth, but through faith and sacrifice. Alban's life wasn't long, and his moment of courage wasn't drawn out over years. But it didn't need to be. His witness has endured for centuries, not because of who he was, but because of the God he trusted. He showed us that faith, even in the face of death, speaks louder than fear ever could. Now think about this. Alban wasn't born into a life of faith. His story began with an act of compassion, a choice to shelter someone in danger. That single decision led him to discover a truth that changed everything for him. Doesn't that make you wonder how a single choice in our own lives could change someone else's story or even our own? Even as he faced the ultimate cost, Alban didn't waver. He knew his life wasn't really his to hold on to. It was a gift, meant to point others to something far greater. And that's exactly what it did. His courage inspired others to stand firm. His story lit the way for generations, and his faith reminded us all that even one person, surrendered to God, can be used to shape history. Believers, Alban's witness is eternal because it calls to us even now. It asks us, how will you live? What will you stand for? And when your story is told, will it reflect the light of a faith that endures? As we close, remember this. Alban's sacrifice wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. His life is a reminder that faith, when lived boldly, never truly dies. It carries on, calling others to trust and believe. Alban's story didn't end with his sacrifice. It continues with us. If his courage moved you, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of faith. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join us as we explore more stories that challenge, uplift, and inspire. Let's carry Alban's legacy forward together.